Imagine getting a knock on your door from a police officer who tells you your husband is dead, only you know he's sleeping upstairs. That's what happened to me. And if you've ever had a moment where reality just completely crumbles, stick around because what I found in that bedroom was 1,000 times worse than a ghost. Your husband. My name is Carol, and thank you for joining me today. I'd love to see where everyone is tuning in from, so drop your city in the comments below. My story starts in my garage, which was my happy place. I was deep into the engine of my '72 Chevelle, covered in grease and happier than I'd been in months. The smell of motor oil and gasoline is my version of a scented candle. That old car was the last piece of my dad I had left, and every time I got that beast of an engine to roar, I felt like he was right there with me. It had been acting up all week, sputtering like a grandpa trying to blow out birthday candles. But that's the great thing about cars, they're straightforward. A problem has a solution. You find it, you fix it, and you move on. I wish marriage was that simple. That same morning, the tension between me and my husband, Gregory, was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I'd walked into the kitchen looking for a coffee lifeline. He was already there, glued to his phone, his thumb swiping a mile a minute. "Morning," I said, trying to sound cheerful. He grunted something that sounded like a yes without even looking up. The silence that followed was heavy, a cold fog that had seeped into our home months ago and refused to leave. He was physically present, but his mind was a million miles away. "Anything good?" I asked, pointing at his screen. He glanced up, his eyes flashing with annoyance. "It's just work, Carol. It's always work." He slammed the phone face down on the table, a move that felt more like hiding something than ending a conversation. A little later, he complained about a migraine and went to lie down. I didn't push it. It was just easier to let it go and escape to my garage. I cranked up some Creedence Clearwater Revival on the radio, the kind of music that makes you feel like you're 20 again, not 54. And for the first time all day, I could breathe. There were no work emails, no demanding clients, and no husband making me feel invisible in my own house. It was just me, my tools, and the deeply satisfying click of a wrench on a bolt. It was my version of therapy. Then I heard the knock. It wasn't a friendly neighbor knock. It was a hard official knock, the kind that means your world is about to be turned upside down. 3 sharp raps that sliced right through the music. I groaned, wiped my greasy hands on a rag that had probably been new in the '90s, and stomped to the front door, expecting some kid selling cookies. But it was a cop. He was young, maybe 30, with a face so earnest he looked like he should be quarterbacking a college team, not delivering tragedies. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, shifting his weight and clutching his hat like a shield. Bad news has a certain weight to it, and this guy was carrying a ton of it. His uniform was dark with rain from the miserable drizzle that had been falling all day. He looked like he was already at a funeral. Turns out he was. "Ma'am," he began, his voice soft but firm. Cops don't make house calls on a Saturday afternoon to give you good news. I felt a cold dread creeping up my spine. "Are you Carolyn Pierce?" "Depends on who's asking," I deflected, a nervous habit of mine. "Yeah, that's me." "What's going on, officer?" He cleared his throat, holding my gaze. I swear they must have a class at the police academy called The Sympathetic but Unflinching Stare. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I have some very difficult news." He took a deep breath. "Your husband, Gregory Pierce, was in a fatal car accident about an hour ago." The words didn't just land, they detonated. Fatal. Accident. Gregory. My mind scrambled to make sense of it, but the pieces were all wrong. It was like he'd handed me a puzzle from a completely different box. For a second, the whole world muted, and all I could hear was the rain and the frantic drumming of my own heart. And then I did something utterly crazy. I laughed. Not a funny laugh, but a raw, ugly sound that clawed its way out of my throat. "No," I said, shaking my head. "That's impossible. You've got the wrong house, the wrong guy, the wrong everything." I jabbed a greasy thumb toward the second floor. "Gregory is upstairs, asleep. He's had a terrible migraine all day." The officer's face didn't register pity or patience. It was just pure, unfiltered confusion. He looked like a man whose entire training manual had just burst into flames. I expected him to talk about the stages of grief, about denial. Instead, he just looked baffled. "Ma'am," he said, his voice slow and careful, like he was talking down a crazy person. "This isn't a what-if situation. We have a positive ID," he continued. "The car is registered to him at this address. We found his wallet, driver's license, credit cards. It's all him." "Then you found the wrong wallet," I snapped, a sudden wave of absolute certainty washing over me. This was a mistake, a massive, horrifying mistake, and I was going to prove it. I spun around and marched toward the stairs. "Come on, I'll show you. He's right up there, probably wondering what all the noise is about." Every step up those stairs felt like climbing a mountain. I could hear the cop's heavy footsteps right behind me. We passed our photo gallery on the wall, our wedding day 22 years ago, our daughter Illa growing up before my eyes, an entire life framed in silver that he was telling me was over. Not a chance, I thought. I heard the third step creak, the one I was always nagging Gregory to fix. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the officer's hand drift down to rest on his holstered weapon. The movement sent a chill through me, but I was on a mission. I was going to prove him wrong. "Greg, honey," I called out, my voice sounding fake and chirpy. "There's an officer here who seems to think you've died. Can you come tell him he's made a huge mistake?" I threw the bedroom door open with all the confidence of a woman who knew she was right. The room was dark, the blackout curtains blocking the gloomy afternoon. And there he was, a lump under the comforter, the gentle rise and fall of breathing, his dark hair spread out on the pillow. My husband. Exactly where he was supposed to be. A huge wave of relief crashed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. "See?" I said, turning to the officer with a triumphant "I told you so" grin. I reached for the lamp. One very much alive husband, safe and sound. The light flickered on, and in that instant, the officer's entire posture changed. His hand shot to his side, and he drew his gun in one smooth, terrifying motion. "Ma'am," he barked, his voice suddenly sharp as glass, "step away from the bed, now." I froze. What? Why? The words were stuck in my throat. My brain saw the scene, but it refused to understand. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The hair was right, the old flannel pajamas were his favorite pair, but the body, it was too still, too perfect. A wax figure in a museum is more lifelike. Under the lamplight, the skin had a weird, waxy sheen. "That is not a person, Mrs. Pierce," the officer said, his gun now aimed at the bed, his eyes darting around the room. "That's a mannequin." My blood ran cold. I stumbled closer, my mind screaming, "No, no, no." But he was right. It wasn't just a mannequin. It was a sickeningly realistic replica of my husband. It had the little white scar over his left eye from when he fell off his bike as a kid. It even had the tiny mole by his ear. Someone had created a horrifying copy of my husband. It was wearing his pajamas, his wedding ring was on its cold plastic finger, and it was tucked into our bed. For a long, silent moment, I just stared at the thing that had so completely fooled me, and the faint scent of his aftershave coming from the pillow was suddenly the most terrifying thing in the world. My world ended with the flash of red and blue lights dancing across my living room walls. One minute, I was living the quiet suburban dream. The next, my front lawn was swarming with cops and nosy neighbors, their whispers cutting through the crackle of police radios. My home, my safe space, had been turned into a crime scene. People in sterile blue gloves and paper booties were treating my life like an archaeological dig, dusting my memories for fingerprints and sealing pieces of my heart in plastic bags marked evidence. I was a stranger in my own kitchen, wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket that felt more like a straitjacket than a comfort. A detective named Wallace, a man whose face was a roadmap of disappointment, was grilling me. His younger, silent partner just stared, his eyes soaking up every detail. "Mrs. Pierce?" Detective Wallace repeated, his pen hovering over his notepad. "When's the last time you saw your husband alive?" I tried to cut through the thick fog of shock that filled my head. "This morning," I said, my own voice sounding distant. He said he had a migraine and went to lie down around 10:30. And you were in the garage from 10:30 until you found him? Yes, I answered. I was fixing up my car. The radio was loud. I didn't hear a thing. He jotted something down. And you didn't find it odd that your husband was in bed with a department store mannequin? The question was so bonkers it almost made me laugh. Of course I didn't know. I thought it was him, I snapped. Who on God's green earth checks to see if their sleeping husband has been replaced by a life-sized doll? He just stared at me, unimpressed. How were things between you two? He pressed on, his voice flat. Any money problems? Anyone hold a grudge? He was asking about our retirement funds, our life insurance policies. They were standard questions, I guess, but each one felt like he was pointing a finger right at me. I thought about how quiet our house had become lately, how the silence between us had grown into a wall. But that was just marriage after 22 years, right? The slow, comfortable slide from passion into routine. It wasn't a reason for whatever this was. We had our issues, like any couple, I said, choosing my words with care, but nothing that would ever lead to this. As if on cue, my neighbor from across the street appeared at the door. It was Mrs. Gable, a woman whose favorite pastime was spying through her curtains, now holding a casserole dish. "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed, her eyes gleaming with a sick mixture of pity and rubbernecking curiosity. "I saw the commotion and just had to check on you." Her gaze darted past me, trying to get a peek at the action inside. I could already hear the gossip spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. Carolyn Pierce, the poor woman whose husband turned out to be a mannequin. It was the setup for a truly terrible joke. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of thinly veiled accusations, they told me I had to go. I couldn't stay in my own home. I just drove, letting the rhythmic thwack of the windshield wipers score the absolute chaos spiraling in my mind. I ended up at some generic hotel off the highway, in a beige room that smelled like bleach and sadness. I perched on the edge of the stiff bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the day's insanity. That mannequin? It was too perfect, too detailed. This wasn't some random prank. This was calculated. Someone knew our house, our daily rhythm. Someone knew Gregory well enough to perfectly recreate the little white scar above his left eye. And that's when a name slammed into my mind. Brenda, my business partner, my best friend. She was just at our house last week for dinner, gushing about Gregory's big promotion. Now that I thought about it, she'd been around a lot lately, always using work projects as an excuse. Brenda, who knew our schedules like the back of her hand. A cold, heavy dread started to pool in my stomach, colder than the rattling air conditioner in that cheap hotel room. For the next 3 days, I was a ghost in room 214. I'd order greasy diner food I had no intention of eating and watch my own house on the evening news. The reporters called it the mannequin mystery, and the police, they said, were baffled. It felt like I was watching a movie about someone else's life imploding. The police called twice, asking me to come down to the station for a few more questions. Their tone was polite, but the message was loud and clear. I was their number one suspect. The grieving wife is always suspect number one, right? Especially when the case is this weird. I was completely and utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Friends would call, but how could I explain? Yeah, my husband's gone, but there's also a life-size doll of him in our bed, and no, I don't know why. They'd think I'd lost my mind. I needed help, and not just from some lawyer. I needed someone who would actually believe me. I needed my little sister, Diane. We were polar opposites. I craved stability. She lived for chaos. She dropped out of law school because it was too predictable and became a private investigator. She was whip-smart, stubborn as a mule, and had zero respect for authority. We hadn't spoken in months. Our last phone call ended with her telling me I was slowly drowning in a sea of beige suburbia. Funny how right she was. My hand trembled as I dialed her number. She picked up on the second ring. "Diane," I whispered, my voice cracking, "I need you." And then, everything came pouring out. I told her the whole insane story. The cops, the mannequin, the questions, this soul-crushing hotel room. I told her about Gregory's odd behavior lately and the sick, twisting feeling I had about Brenda. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the wheels turning in her brilliant, chaotic mind. "And it never occurred to you to just ask him what was going on?" Her voice had that classic little sister smirk in it, but right then, I didn't care. "I'm not the jealous type, Diane," I said weakly, the same lame excuse I'd given the cops. I trusted him. We were married for 22 years. "Carol," she sighed, and I could hear the exasperation clear as day. "You're not the jealous type, you're the head-in-the-sand type. Big difference." She said it like a doctor giving a diagnosis. "Okay, don't move. Don't talk to the cops again. Don't talk to anyone. I'm coming. I'll be there in 3 hours." And she was. 3 hours later, my hotel room door flew open, and in walked Diane like a hurricane, armed with a laptop, a giant thermos of coffee, and an aura of pure, uncut competence that instantly made the air in the room easier to breathe. She took one look at the mess of cold food containers and my sleep-deprived face, and for a second the hard-boiled PI vanished. She was just my sister again. She wrapped me in a hug that felt like steel. "We're going to fix this," she said, her voice soft. "I promise." And for the first time in days, I actually believed it. Diane transformed that depressing hotel room into her own personal war room. The smell of stale despair was replaced by the aroma of strong coffee and the quiet hum of her laptop as she worked her magic. She was a whirlwind, typing at lightning speed and making hushed, intense phone calls, pulling strings and accessing information I never knew existed. I just tried to stay out of her way. On the 4th night, she came back to the room late. There was no coffee in her hands, no bag of takeout, just a thick manila folder which she dropped onto the cheap desk with a heavy, final-sounding thud. Her face was a mask of stone. "Sit down, Carol," she said, her voice totally flat. That's a sentence that never leads to good news. "Is it bad?" I asked, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. "It's worse," she said, pulling out a chair. She opened the folder, and my entire world came crashing down. The first photograph she slid across the table felt like a physical blow. It was Gregory, my Gregory, walking out of a fancy downtown hotel. His hand was resting on the lower back of another woman. That woman was Brenda Vance, my partner, my friend. They didn't look like colleagues. They looked like lovers, flushed and happy after a secret afternoon together. "That son of a bitch," I breathed, the words tasting like poison. "Oh, it gets so much worse," Diane said, her voice cold and sharp. She dealt out more photos like they were cards in a rigged game. Gregory and Brenda at a cozy lunch, their hands intertwined. Gregory and Brenda kissing in his car in a dark parking lot. The timestamps on the photos went back a full 6 months. 6 months of lies, 6 months of stolen moments while I was working my tail off to build the business I thought we both shared. But the cheating, as sickening as it was just the tip of the iceberg. The real nightmare was in the next stack of papers Diane pulled out. The phone logs revealed a constant stream of calls between Greg and Brenda, plus a ton more to some guy named Leo Caney. Diane pointed to his slick, smiling picture and said, "This man, Leo Caney, is what you'd call a life transition specialist. He's a total scumbag who makes people vanish. We're talking new names, fake passports, accounts in the Caymans, the whole 9 yards." A chill went down my spine. This wasn't some simple affair he was having because he felt old. This was a full-blown conspiracy. But the real gut punch came next. Diane flipped open her laptop, revealing a cloud drive she'd broken into. It was Greg's, set up under a fake name, and it was filled with photo after photo he'd secretly taken with his phone. There were snapshots of my financial records, my company's contracts, my investment accounts, my private retirement statements, our life insurance policies, the deed to our home. He even had a picture of the combination to our safe, which I had stupidly jotted down and tucked away in my desk. He had been methodically documenting my entire financial existence, from our shared savings down to the college fund we'd so painstakingly saved for our daughter, Illa. He was building a complete catalog of my life so he could liquidate it. "Carol, he wasn't just going to leave you," Diane said, her voice a low, angry growl as she put a hand on my arm. "He and Brenda were getting ready to empty every one of your accounts, stage his death so nobody would suspect a messy divorce, and then just disappear with every last cent you've ever earned. The staged death was their safety net. If you started getting suspicious before he could bolt, you'd discover a body, and everyone would just accept the police's version of events. Their goal was to leave you with absolutely nothing, not just penniless, but grieving and dismissed by the authorities as a crazy, hysterical widow." I just stared at the mountain of proof. The absolute ice-cold precision of it all was staggering. Every "I love you," every dinner we shared, every single moment of the last year had been a complete act. While I was putting in extra hours at work to secure our future, he was carefully orchestrating my ruin. The man I loved, the father of my child, had been plotting to wipe me off the face of the earth. I sat there, swallowed by the silence of that generic hotel room, with the evidence of my life's greatest lie laid out on the bed. My first feeling was pure, uncut rage, a blinding fire that burned through the shock and grief, forging something hard and sharp inside me. I wanted to scream my lungs out. I wanted to go to Brenda's house and break every single thing in it. My second thought, the one the old, law-abiding Carol would have had, was to call the police. I could just hand them this folder and watch them haul Greg and Brenda away. "So what's next?" I asked Diane, my voice disturbingly level, almost detached. "Do I call Detective Wallace? Do I get a divorce lawyer to chase a ghost? What's the playbook for this?" Diane leaned back, the cheap hotel chair groaning, and just watched my face. She could see the shift in me, the new fire behind my eyes. She gave me a long, calculating look, the kind of look that said she was about to propose something that would either be my salvation or land me in a federal penitentiary. "You could go that route," she said, weighing each word. "You could be the perfect little victim. Give all this to the police. They'll launch a fraud case. You'll be dragged through a legal hell that will last for years. The news stories would probably tank your business, since clients tend to shy away from that kind of mess. And in the end, after blowing a fortune on attorneys, you might get back half of whatever money is left." She let that miserable picture hang in the air for a moment, then a slow, predatory grin spread across her lips, a look I hadn't seen since we were kids scheming against a neighborhood bully. "Or," she said, leaning in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "you could let them believe their little plan is working perfectly, right up to the very last moment. You could let them step right into the trap they so carefully set for you, and then you could take everything from them, just like they were going to do to you, only you'll do it better." I just stared at her. The thought was insane. It was reckless. It was definitely illegal. It was the kind of thing the old Carol, the rule follower, the trusting wife, would have been horrified by. But the old Carol was gone. She had evaporated in that hotel room, surrounded by the proof of her husband's treachery. Standing in her place was someone else, someone colder, tougher, and more furious than I ever knew I could be. A slow smile formed on my face, matching my sister's. "They're the ones who started this game," I said, the words tasting like power. "The least I can do is be the one to finish it." A flash of raw pride lit up Diane's eyes. "There's my sister," she said. And just like that, in a rundown hotel room that smelled of stale coffee and betrayal, we started to scheme. We mapped it all out on the hotel's cheap notepads. It turns out that plotting revenge is a lot like orchestrating a corporate takeover, only instead of trying to maximize profit, you're trying to maximize suffering. The genius of their plan was also its greatest weakness. It completely depended on me being the same predictable, grieving, and slightly naive woman I had always been. They were about to learn they'd made a devastating miscalculation. We weren't going to just foil their plan, we were going to commandeer it. We were going to use the very pieces they had put on the board to build a smarter, more vicious trap. They wanted to erase me? Fine. Let's see how they enjoyed being the ones to disappear. Our first step was to take over their escape route. That meant getting to Leo Caney, the greasy life transition specialist. Diane's deep dive into his life had unearthed a fantastic little piece of leverage. Mr. Kane had some very questionable accounting habits and owed the IRS a huge sum in unpaid taxes and fines. As Diane put it, a well-placed anonymous tip to the right person at the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit can make a man surprisingly helpful. Diane set up a meeting at a dingy truck stop diner about an hour outside the city. The entire place reeked of burnt coffee and failure. Leo Caney slid into our booth, looking every bit the part of a man who sells fake driver's licenses to high schoolers. He was jumpy, his eyes flicking around the room, constantly glancing at the entrance. "Your clients, Gregory Pierce and Brenda Vance, are in some very deep trouble," Diane stated, skipping the small talk. She pushed a folder across the sticky table. It was mostly filled with blank sheets of paper, but the official-looking IRS seal on the top page was all he needed to see. "And they're about to take you down with them. Or," she continued, "you could decide to help us, and maybe your significant tax issues just get lost in the paperwork." It didn't take much persuasion. It's amazing how fast a person's loyalties change when they're looking at a federal audit and potential prison time. Caney told us everything. The accident was set for the coming Saturday on Route 116, a winding and treacherous piece of highway up in the mountains. Greg was supposedly going to be driving to Albany to see a non-existent sick aunt. After the crash, he was to hike a mile to a hidden spot where Caney would be waiting. From there, it was a fast track to new identities and a one-way flight to a carefree life in Costa Rica, all paid for with my money. "Not happening," I said, my voice like chips of ice. I pushed a new envelope toward him, this one fat with cash, the down payment. "Here's what's going to happen now." My next problem was finding a body for the wreck. This was the most difficult part, and that's where Shane Ward entered the picture. Shane was an ex-military guy, tough and incredibly resourceful, and he owed me a huge favor. A couple of years ago, his security company was on the brink of collapse, and I had co-signed a business loan that saved him. More importantly, Shane possessed a certain moral adaptability, sharpened by years in special forces. I met him in a loud sports bar, the kind of place where you can have a private talk and no one will hear a word. When I explained the plan, he just looked at me for a solid minute, then let out a low whistle. "You want me to do what?" he asked, a trace of amused shock in his voice. "Play dead," I said again, perfectly calm. "One car crash. Make it look real. Make it look final. We need the police to find a male corpse in that car so they close the case and stop looking for Gregory." There was a long silence as he took a big swallow of his beer. Then he met my eyes and gave me a grim, approving nod. "Carol, this is without a doubt the most twisted favor I've ever been asked for. I'm in. When do we get started?" With Diane and Shane orchestrating the gruesome details of the accident, I focused my energy on some home improvement. The basement had always been my space. Greg claimed it was too dark and creepy for him, which made it the perfect spot. For the next 3 days, I worked like a woman on a mission. I overnighted professional-grade soundproofing panels from an online supplier. I visited a high-end security shop and bought a reinforced steel door that came with a commercial keypad lock. I spent hours installing it, my power drill screaming as it bit into the concrete. I even ran new plumbing myself, putting in a small working toilet and a sink in the far corner. For furniture, I picked up a simple cot, a table, and a chair from a secondhand shop. I was building a 5-star subterranean hotel where the checkout time would be entirely at my discretion. With every swing of the hammer and every turn of the wrench, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself, forging my own brand of justice with my own 2 hands. It was Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after my entire world had been shattered. The sky was a painfully perfect blue, a cruel joke compared to the dark plan I was about to set in motion. I spent the morning holed up in the garage, the perfect alibi. Only this time I wasn't fixing a car, I was just sitting in mine, waiting. My nerves were wound so tight they could have snapped. Every car that drove by made my heart leap into my throat. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I went inside to make the hardest phone call of my life. I dialed my daughter, Illa, at her college dorm to tell her that her father was gone. The raw, broken sound of her cry traveled through the phone and stabbed me right in the chest. It was a brutal, necessary lie, and the weight of that guilt almost crushed me right there. But I kept it together, my voice cracking with a grief I was only pretending to feel. The official call from the police came at 2:47 p.m. It was a different officer, his voice heavy and somber as he delivered the news I already knew was coming. This time, my performance was flawless. I let out the choked sob I had rehearsed in my mind 100 times. I let the phone drop, making sure it clattered on the floor for a little extra drama. I raced to the hospital, my voice frantic with fake grief as I demanded to see him. When a doctor with kind eyes gently explained that the fire had left the remains too damaged to be viewed, I collapsed into a chair, hiding my face in my hands. It was the acting job of a lifetime. My friend Shane had done his part perfectly. The crash on Route 116 looked utterly convincing. He'd even gotten a few real bruises and a slight concussion to sell the story. He made sure to scatter some of Greg's personal things around the wreck, the watch I gave him for our 15th anniversary, his favorite sunglasses. We had even managed to get our hands on the dental records of a John Doe that were just close enough to pass an initial check. As far as the world was concerned, Gregory Pierce was officially dead and gone. The funeral took place on Thursday. It was a closed casket, of course. I stood graveside, cloaked in black, graciously accepting condolences from weeping friends and family. And of course, Brenda was there, her face a perfect mask of sorrow. She wrapped me in a tight hug, whispering, "I'm so sorry, Carol. We'll get through this together." A wave of pure, murderous rage washed over me, but I just gave a numb nod, playing the part of the broken widow. The hypocrisy was almost suffocating. Meanwhile, about 30 miles from that staged accident, the real main event was happening. A man named Leo Caney met Greg at their designated rendezvous point. He handed Greg a bottle of water to help him calm his nerves, water that was laced with a powerful sedative Shane had supplied. The next time my dear husband opened his eyes, he wasn't on his way to some tropical paradise. He was in his new home, my custom-built, soundproofed basement suite. The plan had worked like a charm. He had simply vanished. He was dead to the world, just as he had planned. The only tiny difference was that his new world was a 10 by 12-foot room right under the house where he'd spent 22 years lying straight to my face. Gregory finally stirred around 6 o'clock in the evening. I'd been watching him on the discreet security cameras I'd installed, seeing him sleep with a peaceful look he hadn't shown me in months. It was the peaceful look of a man who thinks he's just pulled off the perfect crime. The very first thing he did when his eyes fluttered open was call out a name. A single word that twisted that knife in my heart just one more time. Brenda. Not me, his wife of 22 years, but her, his partner in crime. His new life. Well, honey, that new life just got a permanent rewrite. As he finally sat up, the sedative still making him clumsy, he took in his new surroundings. The pure confusion on his face was a beautiful sight. This was definitely not the 5-star Costa Rican resort he was dreaming of. Instead of an ocean view and a king-sized bed, he found polished concrete walls and a solid steel door. "What the hell?" he mumbled, his voice hoarse. He staggered to his feet and stumbled to the door, rattling the handle for nothing. You could see the panic starting to flicker in his eyes. I let him stew in that growing terror for a few more minutes. I had waited a long, agonizing year for this moment. I was going to enjoy every second of it. Then I leaned toward the microphone on my desk and flicked on the intercom. "Good evening, Gregory," I said, my voice echoing into his room with perfect, chilling clarity. "I hope you slept well. You'll want to be rested." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock as they darted around the room, finally locking onto the dark camera lens in the corner. "Carol!" His voice cracked, a mix of utter confusion and dawning horror. "Carol, what is this? Where am I? What is going on?" "You're exactly where you wanted to be, sweetheart," I replied, my voice dripping with poison-laced honey. I leaned back in my office chair upstairs, feeling like a director watching the private screening of her own masterpiece. Dead to the world, starting a new life. Congratulations, you got everything you asked for. I clicked a button on my console, and a small TV on his wall flickered to life. It was the local news, and his face was on the screen. He stared, his mouth hanging open in horror, as the anchor described the tragic, fiery car crash that took the life of a beloved local businessman. They showed clips of the mangled car being loaded onto a tow truck. In other news, I continued, my tone as casual as if we were discussing the weather, your funeral was yesterday. It was very moving. Ela gave a beautiful eulogy. You would have been so proud. I went with the closed casket option, given the circumstances. It was a very tasteful service, though. Brenda cried the entire time. A truly believable performance. This is crazy, he stammered, backing away from the TV until he hit the cold concrete wall. You can't keep me here. Brenda will look for me. Brenda will what? I cut him off, my voice turning sharp. Brenda thinks you're dead. Remember? That was the plan. Your plan. I switched the video feed on his screen. Now he was watching a live view from a tiny camera Diane had hidden in a planter outside Brenda's fancy apartment building. And there she was, pacing frantically around her living room, her face a mask of pure panic. Take a good long look, Greg, I said, zooming right in on her face. That's the woman you picked over me. Just watch how deeply she cares about your well-being. He watched as Brenda, unable to get a hold of him or Leo Kane, started making a flurry of calls. Not to hospitals, not to the police. She was calling her lawyer, her accountant, and her offshore banker. She wasn't worried about him at all. She was worried about the money. She was worried about saving her own neck. I let him watch for a full 10 minutes as she frantically worked the phones. The truth was hitting him like a punch to the gut. I could see it on his face, the slow, horrifying realization that he had been nothing more than a pawn. Brenda never loved him. She just used him as a key to get to my money, and now that the key was gone, she was just trying to burn the whole house down to cover her tracks. His brilliant escape plan had just become his own private hell, and he was the only resident. While Gregory was getting to know the four walls of his new reality, Diane and I moved on to phase 2 of our plan, Brenda. The best part about having a sister who's a private investigator is that she knows all kinds of interesting people, including a pair of unemployed actors who were incredibly convincing as a couple of stern, no-nonsense federal agents. On Monday morning, I walked into the office we shared, playing the role of the fragile, grieving widow. It wasn't that hard to look exhausted. I hadn't really slept in days. Brenda showed up looking just as worn out, though I'm sure her reasons were very different from mine. She gave me a hug that felt like being squeezed by a cold, slimy snake. "Carol," she cooed, her voice oozing a fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. "I'm so sorry. I can't believe he's gone. But don't you worry, we'll get through this together." The hypocrisy was so thick you could have sliced it with a knife. That afternoon, while Brenda was out at a long lunch, no doubt with her lawyer, the first domino tipped over. Our 2 federal agents marched into our office, looking official in their business suits and serious expressions. They flashed impressive and completely fake badges at our receptionist and announced loud enough for the whole office to hear that they had a few questions for Miss Brenda Vance about some financial irregularities and shady offshore accounts. They left a very official-looking and very fake subpoena right on her desk. When Brenda got back, the office was buzzing with quiet gossip. I watched from my own office as she read the subpoena, her face cycling through about 6 different shades of pale before landing on a sickly green. She was in my office a minute later, closing the door and trying to act casual while her entire world was visibly imploding. "Carol," she started, her voice shaking just a little. "There might be some complications with a few of my personal investments. It's probably just a big misunderstanding." The beads of sweat popping up on her forehead told me it was much more than that. That evening, I gave Greg a front row seat to his girlfriend's complete and total meltdown. I switched his monitor back to the live feed of Brenda's apartment. She was on the phone again, but this time she was desperately trying to reach Leo Kane, pleading for an emergency getaway. "I need new papers tonight," she shrieked, her voice high and thin with panic. "The whole thing has blown up. There are federal agents asking questions and I need to be gone before they connect me to those offshore accounts." Greg's face was a blank, ghostly mask as he stared at the monitor. So this was the woman he'd torched our marriage for. A gutless wonder, ready to ditch him and their little scheme the second things got messy. You know, the funny thing about a fake investigation is that if you rattle the cage hard enough, sometimes a real monster falls out. Brenda panicked, thinking the feds were breathing down her neck. She started making illegal money moves, trying to funnel a huge chunk of cash from a company account she managed into one of her secret offshore havens. Classic embezzlement. The one thing she didn't count on was me. I saw this coming and had already tipped off a buddy at the Treasury Department to flag those accounts. Her desperate, illegal transfer lit up every alarm from our city all the way to Washington, D.C. She had just stumbled headfirst into a very real federal sting operation. That Wednesday morning, 3 black government SUVs rolled into our office parking lot. These weren't actors this time. This was the real deal. From my window, I watched actual federal agents, holding a legitimate arrest warrant, march right into our building. Brenda caught one glimpse of them and made a break for it. She actually tried to sprint for the back door, clutching that designer purse of hers. They slapped the cuffs on her before she even made it 10 feet. I made sure Greg watched every single second of it on the news that night. The perp walk past the flashing cameras, the reporters yelling questions, the stone-faced U.S. attorney listing the charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and money laundering. The news anchor announced she could face up to 25 years in a federal penitentiary. I leaned back in my office chair, watching my husband on the screen as he watched his lover's entire world collapse on the television in his little concrete cell. I saw that final spark of hope just vanish from his eyes. He'd lost. She'd lost. And me? I had won. I let the silence in his room stretch out, broken only by the news anchor's voice detailing every single one of Brenda's crimes. I wanted him to soak in the full weight of his failure, the absolute obliteration of the life he had tried to rip away from me. I just stood there, watching my husband watch his mistress's life end, and I felt a deep, quiet sense of satisfaction. It wasn't loud or angry. It was just this calm, peaceful feeling, like the universe was finally back in balance. Hey, if you've stuck with me this far, could you do me a huge favor? Hit that like button and drop the number 1 in the comments below. It lets me know you're enjoying the story and that you're right here on this wild ride with me. Your support means everything, and it's what keeps me going. Please, comment the number 1 and let me tell you what happened next. I let him stew on it for 2 solid weeks. 14 days in solitary with nothing but his own crushing guilt, his epic failure, and the 24/7 news coverage of Brenda's spectacular downfall for company. She, of course, was already trying to save her own skin, singing like a canary and trying to pin everything on her dearly departed lover, Gregory. The irony was a bitter pill he was forced to swallow day after day. Finally, the call came over the intercom. His voice wasn't arrogant or panicked anymore. It was just a raw, broken whisper. "Carol, please, I have to see you. I need to talk to you, face to face." I let him wait another hour, just to make it crystal clear who held all the cards now. When I finally swung open that heavy steel door and walked into his little studio, the change in him was staggering. He looked like a ghost of himself. He must have dropped at least 20 pounds. His clothes just hung off his body. His eyes were sunken and utterly defeated. He was just sitting on the edge of the bed with his hands folded in his lap, like a little boy about to be disciplined. I pulled over the plain wooden chair I'd put in there and sat down across from him. The silence was heavy for what felt like an eternity. "Why?" he finally croaked, his gaze glued to the concrete floor. "Why go through all of this? A divorce? You could have just filed for divorce. The courts would have given you everything. You could have ruined me." It was a valid question, and I'd had 2 long, silent weeks to craft my answer. "Because divorce is civilized," I said, my voice perfectly calm and level. "Divorce suggests we're 2 rational adults who just drifted apart, who could shake hands and divide up the assets. But that isn't what happened, is it, Greg? You didn't just want to walk away. You wanted to annihilate me. You wanted to take my money, my company, my whole future, and leave me with nothing but a forged death certificate and a cloud of police suspicion. You didn't want a divorce, Gregory. You wanted a funeral. My funeral. You just didn't want anyone else to be there. That's when he started to cry. Not the dramatic, self-pitying sobs I was expecting, but these horrible, racking sobs of a man who has been completely shattered. "I'm sorry," he choked out between gasps. "I'm so sorry, Carol. I made a mistake." "A mistake," I said, my voice like ice, "is forgetting to buy milk at the grocery store." This was a plot, a betrayal. Now, listen closely, because here's what happens next. I leaned in, forcing him to look me in the eye. "You have a choice. Option 1, you stay in here, forever. You'll be safe, you'll be fed, and to the world outside, you will simply cease to exist. You will live out the rest of your life in this room." His eyes went wide with terror. "Carol, you can't." "Option 2, I said, cutting him off sharply. "I help you vanish for real. A new name, a new history, enough money to start over someplace where nobody will ever think to look for you. You get a life, but you give up every piece of your old one, your name, your past, your friends, your family." I let that last word hang in the air, twisting it like a knife. "Your daughter." The mention of our daughter, Illa, hit him like a punch to the gut. He physically recoiled, a gasp of pure agony escaping his lips. Illa. Our beautiful, brilliant 19-year-old daughter. In her world, her loving father had died in a tragic car wreck. She was deep in mourning, and he was the one who had put her there. "Illa," he whispered, the name sounding like a prayer. "My baby girl. How is she?" "She's heartbroken," I said, the words sharp because they were true. "But she's tough. She's so much stronger than you ever realized. If you take option 2, I said, pushing my final, most cruel advantage, if you agree to disappear from our lives and never ever try to make contact again, I'll make sure you get pictures, updates on how she's doing. Big moments. Her graduation, maybe her wedding day. Not all the time, but just enough for you to see that she's okay." It wasn't a choice, not really. It was a choice between a concrete prison and an emotional one. A choice between two different versions of hell, except one offered a tiny, agonizing peek into the heaven he had thrown away. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with 22 years of a shared life, now twisted into this horrible, tragic ending. "I want to see my daughter grow up," he whispered, his voice thick with tears he was trying to hold back. "Even if it's just in pictures." "Then we have a deal," I said, getting up to leave. The discussion was over. "Tomorrow you become someone else, and Gregory Pierce stays 6 feet under, right where he belongs." 3 months after Gregory Pierce was laid to rest in Greenwood Cemetery, a quiet, nondescript man named Gary Hayes started a job at a hardware store in a tiny, forgotten town in rural Idaho. He had a perfectly faked resume, a plausible backstory about starting fresh after a nasty divorce, and the haunted eyes of a man who had lost it all. The store owner, a gruff older man who'd had his own messy split, hired him to manage the inventory and didn't pry too much. Gary was quiet, kept to himself, and lived in a small apartment over the shop. He became the exact kind of guy who could blend into the wallpaper of small-town America and never leave a trace. Meanwhile, back in my real life, things started to bloom in a way they hadn't for years. With Brenda behind bars and her name scraped off the company letterhead, our firm, now just Pierce Consulting, took off. It turns out that being the innocent, grieving widow of one partner and the betrayed victim of the other makes people see you as incredibly competent and trustworthy. Business poured in. The $250,000 life insurance payout from Greg's death went directly into a trust for Ila's college education and her first home, and Ila, my amazing Ila, was thriving. The grief she carried for the father she thought she'd lost had forged a new kind of resilience in her. She poured all her energy into her studies, and our weekly chats on the phone became the highlight of my week, filled with a closeness we hadn't had in years. On the fourth Saturday of every month, I would drive to a post office box in a town 50 miles away to mail a plain manila envelope to a P.O. box in Idaho. Inside, there were always photos. Ila beaming after making the dean's list. Ila laughing with her friends on a ski trip. Ila, vibrant and happy, growing into a phenomenal young woman. I never included a letter, never a single note. Just the pictures. Just the proof that his sacrifice, in a twisted way, hadn't been for nothing. It was a unique brand of cruelty wrapped in the thinnest sliver of mercy. 5 years went by. 5 years of me rebuilding a better life from the rubble. 5 years of Gary Hayes living his lonely life in exile, and 5 years of Isla blossoming into a woman I admired more than anyone else in the world. The day was absolutely perfect, one of those crisp May afternoons that feels like a brand new start. I was sitting in the crowded auditorium at her university, my heart just bursting with a pride so intense it was almost painful, watching my daughter stride across the stage to get her engineering degree. Summa cum laude. As I looked around at all the proud, smiling families, my blood suddenly ran cold. There, tucked away in the shadows of the very back row, wearing a baseball cap pulled down low and a pair of oversized sunglasses, was a man I would know anywhere. He was thinner, older, with more silver at his temples, but it was him. Unmistakably him. That man over there? He didn't just break my heart, he stole my life savings and left me and our newborn daughter with absolutely nothing. And after 5 years of silence, he had the nerve to show up at her graduation. My first thought was pure, cold panic. What if he tried to talk to her? What if he shattered this perfect day we fought so hard for? If you've ever been completely betrayed, hit that subscribe button, because you'll want to see how this ends. I watched him lift a cheap little disposable camera and snap a few pictures, like a ghost haunting a life he gave up. Oh, believe me, a part of me wanted to wave over security and have him thrown out, to watch his new life crumble just like he crumbled mine. But then, another part of me, a quieter part, saw something else. A father who was missing out on everything. He had driven who knows how many miles and risked his entire new life just for a 2-second glimpse of a moment he threw away. So when the ceremony was over, our eyes locked across the packed gymnasium. His face went white. He knew he was caught. I had him. One word from me, just one little gesture to security, and his world would be over. But instead, I just gave him a single, tiny nod. It was so small, I doubt anyone else even saw it. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a message. I see you, and you have no power over me anymore. The look of stunned relief that washed over his face was more satisfying than any screaming match I could have started. He got the message. I was still in charge. From across the room, I could read the 2 words he mouthed. Thank you. Then he just turned and vanished into the crowd. A few minutes later, while I was hugging my daughter, Ila, she whispered, I wish Dad could have been here. He would have been so proud. I squeezed her tight, my voice thick with emotion, and said, he would have. And for the first time in 5 years, I knew I was telling the truth. I learned something that day. Real justice isn't about payback or getting even. The best revenge is building a beautiful life on the ashes of the one they tried to burn down. I had my daughter, a thriving business, and our whole future ahead of us. He had a few blurry photos and a lifetime of looking over his shoulder. The score was finally settled, and I never had to lift a finger. Thanks for letting me share my story with you all today. It feels good to finally get it out. If you've ever had a moment that showed you just how strong you really are, I would love to read about it in the comments down below. Be good to yourselves and be good to each other, model.